in the graduate curriculum, teacher education, but not only, students of language in general. Some of them are doing research degrees, others teaching degrees. But we've been trying to implement some changes that challenge, more specifically, the role of a teacher and a student, the role of a professor and the role of a student at university. More or less in the post-colonial terms that you were saying, we're not, we professors are not the source of knowledge in this component. So we're just there, our function there is to help students find information, is to help them with informational literacies. This is being such a struggle, you wouldn't imagine. It's been resisted, both from the part of professors and students. So it's quite interesting to see the arguments that people use to explain the need to stick to their traditional roles. So I think that the question of why people resist practices in which they are told to become agents of their meaning-making production.
Yeah. I think it's a very complicated situation, and I think you have to move slowly, and I think you have to recognize that you can't just change things at one institution, because you have to be aware of the system of higher education in Brazil as a whole, but also now globally. On the one hand, it's changing very quickly, so you might have pressures that come from the Bologna process, for example, that change how things are done locally. But I think first of all, you can't ignore the fact that there is a power relationship between professor and student. And you have to acknowledge that, and you have to make it work for you. So it's no use saying, to the student that my 40 years of experience researching and publishing in this area and getting my PhD means nothing, right? Because it does, it means a lot. And it's helpful to the student. You have a certain kind of brand, you have a certain kind of power that you want to use for your students' good. You have to recognize that you do have a kind of power that you cannot give away. That doesn't mean that you can't be a good mentor. It doesn't mean that you have to insist that students be clones of you. No, you don't want clones. But I do think you have more of a role than just guiding students to information. I think you do have an interactive role to help students not just learn how to be good meaning makers, because there still are. There's very poor meaning makers and there's very good meaning makers. The standards may be changing, they may be getting more complicated, but there still are standards that are worth upholding. So I think you have to move slowly. I think that the opposition will come from many quarters, and you always have to understand that there's probably something genuine about that opposition, that there's probably something of value that they need to be reassured can be preserved if you do make these changes. I'm encountering the same thing in my own institution. I think they're moving far too slowly to deal with the modern age. They're practically the only PhD program in English in Canada that still requires students applying to the program to write a 15-page prospectus before they apply, that we know will be meaningless after they come into the program. In fact, I think it's harder to write a 500-word prospectus than a 1,500-word prospectus. But to get our department to change, because they think, more is better, that will show that we're tough, that we have high standards. But have you got other questions? I don't want to go on for too long. Or is there someone else coming in with me?
No, it's just they're asking a question.
So I could go on about that for a long time, because I think this is where we're at right now. I think it's a very frightening moment for a lot of people. And it's also because we don't know. We really don't know what the best way to move forward will be. We know that changes will be necessary. but we don't know what will be in the best interests of our students, our institutions, and our colleagues. So I think we need to share. I think we need to experiences like this, where you talk about your experience at your place, I talk about my experience at mine. We need to know what's happening around the world. When I go to Europe, people tell me they are terrified of the Bologna process, for example, which is reforming higher education in Europe. And you probably know there is a Latin American Bologna process that's working in conjunction with that, because increasingly our graduates need to be able to move freely around the world and have their degrees recognized wherever they go. So we always have to operate within that context and then find out ways to be flexible within it and to change our pedagogical practices as we go. But getting curricular requirements changed is not always so easy. I mean, Valkyria is in the process, I think, of doing that now.
Now, University, yes. Can I also ask you a question? I would be interested in listening to you in that question about globalization theory playing a hegemonic role in organizing a particular way of interpreting the world. This is number 2 in part C.
Yeah.
Now you'd be a bit, this is okay.
Yes, I think that we're always aware that there are certain stories that seem more convincing about why things happen and how the world is changing than other stories. And at the moment, the story of globalization does seem to be dominant and play this kind of hegemonic role that Rivsi identifies. It's a narrative that is complicated. On the one hand, it's a narrative that I think is encapsulated by Friedman's book, The World is Flat. Right? This argument that globalization flattens everything and leads to homogenization. This is the fear about the Bologna process in higher education, that it will flatten everything, make it all the same, get rid of cultural distinctiveness. And if you read Friedman's book, The World is Flat, there is an underlining assumption that global English is the language of this flat world. He never explicitly says it or pays any attention to it, but he just assumes that the flat world speaks English. All his examples are call centers in India where they take American names and speak English in American accents. And this is a dominant view that people are repeating all around the world, and yet, if you read Friedman's book closely, it is a view from a very particular place. It's a view from the United States. From the point of view, looking from the United States, the world seems to be flat and getting flatter, because the US advantage and US exceptionalism is gone. He sees engineers from India and China threatening US power. So from the US, the world seems to be flat. But I argue from other parts of the world is not flat, right? From many other parts of the world, probably even from here, even though Brazil is, rising rapidly to the level of the US in terms of economic power. The world is not flat. So I think that we always have to look at these narratives, these dominant stories, and ask, who is telling this story? Who is persuaded by this story? From what point of view is this story narrated? So that's predominantly what I was thinking about. I think there's probably more that could be, lots more that could be said. I think this is also, globalization is being used as an excuse for a lot of things. So it's being used as an excuse to alter our educational systems. It really terrifies me that Jeb Bush the brother of George W. Bush, has a new Center for Excellence in Education. And his argument is the only way you will get an excellent education is to enable consumers freer choice to buy education privately. So it's built on a false assumption that public education is automatically inferior and that somehow public education does not allow freedom of choice, that it's some kind of imposition of the state. All kinds of stories that are out there and circulating about education that are not really supported by evidence. But if they're repeated often enough around the globe, they seem to take on a certain kind of power, a certain kind of magic, and people begin to start questioning values. So I think when we're talking about multiliteracies and multimodality, we always have to think what they're for. You know, they're for the agency of our students, but they're for, I think, a public good. The assumption that education is merely a private good is, I think, a really dangerous assumption that comes with certain forms of globalization. Yeah.
It is a very strongly believed in Brazil that the public education is not worthwhile, and everybody who's able to pay is sending the children to private schools. And at the moment we are really kind of in a paradox, because there was a proposal to change the legislation which would oblige politicians' children to go to public schools. And
that's a good idea.
Yes, but it is again twofold, because of course I voted for, and I'm going to fight for the introduction of this. But I was thinking that in fact we are somehow constructing an idea of punishment.
Yes,
Okay?
yes,
So I believe it demands a very thorough discussion, and talking to people, to average person in the street who really dreams of sending his child to a private school, and somehow making people fight together with us.
Yes. Well, I think first of all you do need to raise the status of the public schools. You need to pay the teachers better salaries. You need to make the job more socially prestigious. You need to show that you value the work they do, and you need to show that you support them. You need to invest in them.
There is research in Brazil which proves that paying better salaries to teachers doesn't work, doesn't change anything. So the governments in different states are using this kind of argument, scientific argument, not to obey the law.
Scientific argument from
they are in a very weak
Statistics
position.
can always be manipulated. And especially if they're taken out of context. But once that kind of mindset sets in, it's difficult. It's difficult to change, I know. But of course, what you do have in Brazil is that the public universities do have that prestige, do provide that good education. So how do you explain that paradox then, right? It shows that public education can work and does work. And of course, many of the prestigious private universities in the US are not-for-profit private universities. So it's the not-for-profit that is crucial there. In a sense, there's still a public role. But yeah, there's no easy answers. But I think it will make a difference. I think the public schools, if the teachers have the kind of critical capacity that Valkyria was talking about to encourage students in their own agency, then eventually, that will make a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that we have to change the way we, scholars, have looked at public schools